All right, y'all. What is something that we as a collective are usually really uncomfortable with? Mental illness and schizophrenia. What makes us even more uncomfortable? A schizophrenic who's found religion. Hi, I'm the schizophrenic. So, loved ones, let's be a little uncomfortable together as we talk about this. The diagnosis of schizophrenia and the word itself has gone through a lot of changes since it was formally described in 1908. And I get up the slides. Thank you. I know that's hard to see, but that is the current spread of schizophrenia spectrum disorder. We now know that it exists in different forms, the same disorder cluster, but with different duration and intensity of symptoms. Usually those include combinations of delusions, hallucinations, paranoia, and patterns of disorganized speech and behaviors, although not everybody with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder has all of those. My particular fun flavor is schizoaffective disorder, which in a nutshell is the really cool combination of schizophrenia and a mood disorder like major depression, or in my case, bipolar. SSD is among what are called the serious mental illnesses, which are conditions that tend to cause the greatest amount of disability. What constitutes a serious mental illness may change depending on how the phrase is being used, such as in legal contexts, but most definitions also include things like bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, and severe forms of major depression, OCD, and PTSD. But note that calling these serious mental illnesses doesn't diminish the fact that all mental illnesses can be serious and have big impacts on your life. NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, reports that in the United States in 2024, which is the most recent collective data set we have, about 1 in 5 US adults experienced of any form of mental illness, or about 23%. 1 in 20 US adults, or about 5.6, experienced a serious mental illness. And about 1.2% of us met the diagnostic criteria for a schizophrenia disorder, and about 2.8 the criteria for a bipolar disorder. And you can see maybe from this diagram from NAMI that depression and anxiety are by far the most common mental health conditions, and other ones in the US are lower and lower. The most recent World Health Organization data from 2024 estimates that globally, more than 1.2 billion people live with a mental illness. Somewhere about 0.3% of the world has a schizophrenia disorder, and about 0.5 has a bipolar disorder. And so you can kind of see from the dark red of certain countries that the spread of mental illness is not the same everywhere. And that's even accounting for differences in how they're identified and treated. What I'm going to talk about today applies to the broad categories of SMIs, serious mental illnesses, but I'll often describe things in terms of schizophrenia, just because that's my own lived experience. And it's usually what people think of most readily when they hear about psychosis, hallucinations, hearing voices, talking to God, all that good stuff. And then, we know that psychosis has been with us for a very long time, probably as long as we have had brains. Our collective oral and written histories are full of descriptions and tales and myths of those who have seen and interacted with things and beings that seemingly no one else can, with varying degrees over all of our history of reverence, scorn, fear, compassion, hatred, or disgust. But in the past several hundred years, white, patriarchal, predominantly Christian, European, and American attitudes of mental illnesses have been exported around the globe through the processes of colonization, industrialization, subjugation, and some pretty massive superiority complexes. We've created a cultural hegemony and a dominant worldview seeped in individualism, capitalism, and control. we lean hard into the idea that we are fully independent beings, we don't need no one else, and we can do everything alone or at the very largest in small nuclear families. Our reliance on community is really fractured here. And in the US, we have some pretty deep Calvinist and puritanical roots that have not done us any favors. We are, even if we don't believe in these things, we are so steeped in shame and guilt. And anytime someone has a behavior or a brain that doesn't meet our norm, it can be really stigmatizing. We expect usually complete control over oneself and one's behaviors, and a lot of the times often view mental illness as some sort of personal failing, like you're not trying hard enough to get better. Through media and conditioning, we still predominantly see those with serious mental illnesses as dangerous, lacking in empathy, mockable, or just scary, despite us being many times more likely to be the victim of violence and not a perpetrator. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, has become the planetary gold standard of psychiatric diagnosis and treatment options. Our model of understanding mental illness in general and treatment is usually that biology plus medication plus formalized therapy equals a standardized treatment that everybody uses. Our categorizations and descriptions of mental illness and the pharmacologic and therapeutic treatments we use has done a very good job of homogenizing mental illness to our standards, with what some describe as the cost of psychiatric diversity. In the US, the majority of us with psychosis report extremely negative symptoms, screaming voices, the belief that the devil is inhabiting you, that you are sinful, that you are being persecuted and monitored, and that we've internalized something that is inherently broken in our minds and that our suffering is inescapable. And so this way that schizophrenia plays out in the US has been exported to globally, that this is really the only way that schizophrenia is expressed and seen, and it has increasingly come to be. But in more recent years, anthropology and psychology combined has shown us that our culture absolutely drives how things like hallucinations, delusions, and mania are expressed, as well as how they're handled by different communities. It turns out that there are forms and patterns of serious mental illness that are completely unknown or undescribable in either English or in our culture in the US because they are so unique to local systems that we have no experience with. It wasn't until the most recent update of the DSM, revised in 2022, that there was even a chapter on cultural specific presentations of mental illness. And it's a whole 20 pages out of about 1,100. There are far too many individual cultures and beliefs I would love to tell you about, but there is wildly too little time to speak about any with specifics, with the nuances and respect they deserve. We can't fall into the trope of just saying those unspecified tribal cultures had it wonderfully. But broadly, anthropologists have put different cultural practices and beliefs into their own native context, and not with the Western view that has been imposed upon them. Studies are showing that positive outcomes for people with serious mental illnesses are the strongest in cultures that value interdependence, connectivity, communal care, the generous sharing of goods and services, and those that give a meaning or a purpose to what the person is experiencing, rather than applying guilt, shame, or the implication that someone did something wrong to cause it. People with schizophrenia who live in strong community groups tend to have far fewer scary symptoms and are actually much more likely to have neutral to positive voices, hallucinations, and spiritual experiences. For example, a study of people in, I want to say, Kerala, India, in much more hyperlocal communities found that their voices are more likely to be the voice of a relative or a distant cousin reminding them to do things, rather than something horrible. Professor Gabor Mate, in the great documentary Crazy Wise, describes how traditions where people with disturbances are guided and mentored by shaman or other spiritual elders, such as the Anai people in northern Asia or various North American Plains Indian tribes, that there's often a compass or a map to guide you through the dark nights of the soul. One with what we'd call psychosis is encouraged to explore the depths of your psyche with all of the despair and the suffering, but also the beautiful and the profound, and to use that as a point of initiation to open you up to lucidity, spiritual and emotional balance, and a sense of personal destiny. Across various traditions globally throughout so many thousands of years, things like ceremonies, ritual fasting, vision quests, sweat lodges, and other traditional practices have been ways that schizophrenics have been held in reverence and care. In the West, though, when religion is brought into play, instead of seeing mystics or healers, we overwhelmingly believe that if a schizophrenic person is having a deeply religious or spiritual experience, that it is obviously psychosis and a delusion. For normal, sane people, if you ask them what gets them through times of trouble, many will point to spirituality, prayer, or faith. But it's different for those of us who people know are mentally ill. We here at UUI can see how our cultural concepts of mental illness have impacted our beliefs and concerns about people who might serve as religious professionals. And I have one slide. It's hard to see, but when we completed the congregational survey as part of the ministerial search process a couple years ago, the data showed that out of the categories of people asked about, and there were specific ones, we were the least comfortable with the idea of a minister who has something vastly different with their brains, whether it's various forms of mental illness or neurodivergence. And so when I looked at the data, it was anonymized and I didn't see anybody's particular responses. The top 3 categories of discomfort were mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, mental health conditions that can be successfully managed, and neurodivergence. And we're good with the slides now. The question didn't include a category for the severe mental illnesses, but I think it's safe to say that discomfort would be even greater. I got curious and asked what people thought about potential ministers with serious mental illnesses on the Unitarian Universalist subreddit, and the near universal response was that folks honestly would probably never ever consider a minister with schizophrenia or bipolar disorders. Most of the respondents, and there were about 50, said that they'd probably on some level always be questioning someone's ministry, whether they would be able to handle the responsibilities of pastoral care, whether they could empathize appropriately, or what would happen if they suddenly had a break, and how would it impact the church? Which are not unreasonable questions, but there were also comments that some people would have a hard time wondering if their minister was just practicing their delusions. And what if a church was just uplifting someone's feelings of power, which I thought was a little sad. And some people said that they wouldn't be okay with a parish minister, but maybe would be fine with someone being a chaplain or maybe a community minister instead. Others did indicate that they might be open to a minister with a serious mental illness, but it would have to be someone who's had years to decades of proven stability and a really great psychiatric assessment that everybody would be privy to. And none of this, either what our survey indicated or what these people on Reddit said, was surprising to me, but it really gave me a thought to think about, especially as I do more lay ministry here at UUI. What I think we need is a truly liberatory theology of mental illness, and our churches absolutely have the capacity to do this. Liberation theology as a movement originated in Latin America in the 1960s with radical Catholic priests and activists, and the original idea was summed up like this: God is on the side of the oppressed. In a seminal 1973 book on the theology, it was groundbreaking in that it reframed Christian scripture from the perspective of the marginalized and said that the Catholic Church must take actions to liberate the poor through addressing the socioeconomic and structural root causes of poverty. And this was a totally wild idea to so many people. Over the years, liberation theology has spread and expanded into different realms and much further than Catholicism. There's Black liberation theology, which grew out of African American churches in the US, that provides a framework based in religious scripture to show that resistance against systems of subjugation is divine. We have Palestinian liberation theology that is not recent, that articulates that cultural elimination and genocide is incompatible with the message of Jesus, himself a Palestinian Jew, and his doctrine of love. One can find liberatory theology and interpretations of holy texts across all of the world religions, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhist philosophies. But adherence to a particular scripture is not strictly necessary, such as the cases of queer, feminist, and different disability theologies. Secular humanists can also apply these frameworks too, when we draw upon art, music, poetry, and writing to influence our faith that we have in each other. UU Reverend Angela Herrera writes, "Another way to put it, a more humanist way, is that oppression and injustice prevents the full flourishing of life and of the human spirit. And since whatever happens to one happens to all, the impact of oppression is to diminish the oppressor's humanity as well as others." Liberation theology necessitates action and not just thought exercises. A theology of mental illness looks like working to change the forces that create stigma, fear, disgust, hatred, forced confinement, and the abandonment of those whom we label as broken. It means creating radically welcoming communities of universal interdependence, both inside our churches and outside. It means recognizing that mental illness is not inseparable from poverty, racism, homophobia, and other forms of bigotry. It means building up the foundation of a healthier society rather than just putting on a Band-Aid on the systems that we have. And now, I am not claiming that other cultures magically have it right and live in sunshines and rainbows, because we know that's not true. And I personally don't think it's possible to entirely shelter us with psychosis and severe mental illnesses from every incredibly scary and damaging symptom that our brains can spit out. And creating an environment for these things to be easier on us is not going to be easy in general. We can't create societal healing through good vibes alone. And also, I want to be clear that I don't dismiss our psychiatry and neurobiology, and that it hasn't and can't improve the lives of people cross-culturally. I know myself that I am extremely reliant on excellent psychiatric care, and I would not be in the stable place I am without it. Research across ethnic, cultural, and racial communities shows that there clearly is a large component of mental illness that is linked to and driven by biology and genetics and chemical signaling. But we here in the West have vastly underestimated how much of our mental suffering is literally constructed by the society we live in. Even if we purely think of serious mental illnesses as caused by internal chemicals and cellular biology, having strong communities and social structures protects those of us with genetic susceptibilities and pathways in our brains that don't prime us for success. We know that factors that positively impact the expression and severity of mental illness are the provision and access to affordable and safe housing, nutritious food, clean water, comfortable clothing, equitable health care, child care provided with love, and spiritual care that holds us as whole people. What would it look like for our understanding of mental illness if we were collectively provided for with what we know is possible and in abundance yet withheld from so many by the choices of those with the most money, power, and social standing. UUs have already been doing the work of moving from awareness of mental illnesses to acceptance to the normalization of many of them, like depression, anxiety, and trauma. We do practice radical welcoming. One of our strongest values is that all people are inherently worthy of love, and we understand our central unifying experience to be love. We partner with excellent organizations and our own that fight against all forms of oppression across the axis of marginalization. But if we're being honest with ourselves, we haven't fully engaged with the work yet to unshackle ourselves from our ingrained beliefs regarding serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar. We shy away from talking about it. And our Unitarian heritage has especially influenced a lot of us to employ logic, reason, and science above all else, which can be used to dismiss the more subjective experiences of reality. We aren't immune from projecting guilt and shame on people or expecting certain behaviors. However, we are primed through our commitment to social justice and activism to do better. Some ways that our communities can help is just by approaching those of us with psychosis, hallucinations, schizophrenia, all of the fun stuff, with genuine curiosity and openness. You don't have to have preconceived notions of how you expect us to be. Just by knowing I have schizophrenia doesn't mean you have to treat me like I have the ability to break down right in front of you and, talk about the CIA coming to get me. Never underestimate the power of deep, active listening. It's not feeding a delusion to listen to somebody respectfully. The way I describe it is you can validate our emotions without validating the interpretations, even if you think they aren't quite right. Letting someone know that they're just being seen and listened to is so healing. And don't treat our mental illnesses as a death sentence. Believe with us that we can still find joy and lead happy and fulfilling lives, even amidst the struggles that we deal with. And let us have a voice in our spiritual institutions, because we truly may have a different lens through which we touch and interact with things that are the great mysteries of life. Maybe schizophrenics can be allowed a touch of prophetic vision and divinity too. By realizing that our own culture does not have all of the answers, and by gaining knowledge from how other people across time have handled mental illness in their communities, we might be able to shape our own here into one that is more open and accepting. So, does this knowledge about me that I have schizoaffective disorder make you uncomfortable? Are you having some questions or immediate quick thoughts that pop into mind that maybe wonder how I'm able to handle being a worship associate or having leadership roles in the church? And I do wonder if I talk about more specifics of my own spiritual experiences, are some people just going to think I'm delusional? But it's okay. I'm not mad or judging. Our first thoughts aren't necessarily the ones that we believe or want to believe, but what we're trained to think. It's our second, corrective, nuanced thoughts that matter when they translate to how we want to treat each others and be with them. And this isn't about me, it's about everyone. Those who are open about mental illnesses, especially the serious ones, those who never disclose that information to anybody else. It's about those who might walk through our doors, but also the people we pass on the street. It's about the interconnected web of all beings. My charge to us as UUs is to apply liberation theology with creating collective change that benefits us all by actively working to investigate our biases and then dismantle our cultural attitudes that target and isolate the seriously mentally ill. It doesn't matter if we believe in God, gods, spirits, powers of nature, or a great mystery that is just part of the universe. It doesn't matter if our beliefs lie in more on logic, reason, and science to explain things. What matters to us as UUs is that the power of love is on the side of the oppressed, and that by fully embracing those of us who are different, markedly different sometimes, we live into love and wholeness together. May it be so.